discussion on the implications of the recent trial in Italy.
Thank you. Thanks, David. I would like to start with a very personal statement. When this happened last week, when the outcome of the trial in L'Aquila actually went to the news and I heard of it, that touched me a lot because I was in my previous life before I became involved in atmospheric sciences again. I was in charge of setting up a tsunami early warning system in Indonesia. And there I was in the same situation. I was asked as an expert to give advice to local decision makers on inundation maps. And I felt very well how these people who were at trial and actually were convicted eventually felt when they were asked to give advice to some extent. So I tried to, and first of all I was shocked, of course. Why could somebody be charged for manslaughter just because he gave scientific advice? So I did some research into the case and wanted to know what was really going on. And so I think this is very, very interesting for the scientific community as a whole, and in particular for us as atmospheric, climate, whatever, ocean-related scientists who will eventually be in the situation to deal with extreme events. And so I digged a little bit into that case, and I would like to discuss with you what I found and what you think about it, because that is something that really kind of moves me as a citizen more than as a scientist, but also as a scientist. So I would like to, by the way, is there anybody from L'Aquila here? Oh, you are? Okay, so then you might assist me in the details, because I might not have all the details correct. Maybe
just my passion.
That's good. Okay, so very, very nice. Very welcome. Right, so I would like to introduce that by three different aspects of the whole thing. That is, one, I want to introduce a little bit about the facts. I want to talk a little bit about principles that I found in that case that are leading more beyond that special case and into our discussion, and then I want to discuss questions and consequences from that. So let's start with the facts. L'Aquila is actually located in the most risky or earthquake-prone area in Italy. So it is known to have a very high risk of being exposed to an earthquake. And it happened actually over in history several times. The L'Aquila was more or less flattened by earthquakes. One of the major events in 1703 in a way caused the whole city to be extinguished more or less, and then it was rebuilt afterwards, and 5,000 people were dead in that area and so on. So it was known to be a very high-risk area in terms of earthquake risks. So here you see this map actually shows the risk of being exposed to an earthquake of a certain peak ground acceleration. And there are all other measures as well as the occurrence rate and things like that. Okay, so in 2009, actually on the 6th of April, it occurred again, and a major earthquake happened in L'Aquila. This is the shake map, I think, by USGS, and the magnitude was measured to be 6.3, and this earthquake occurred local time 3:30 a.m., so at night, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people were killed. And you can see the shake map here. The shaking was so violent that actually 350 people lost their lives, 1,600 or roughly 1,600 were injured, 65,000 displaced, 20,000 buildings destroyed. So it was really a very big event, and as far as I read, it was the worst natural disaster in Italy in the last 100 years, in terms of casualties and also economic loss. So you can see that the city, and actually till to date, the city center is closed. There's no access, it's barricaded, so the public is not allowed to enter. Reconstruction didn't really take place yet. So it's really, you still see a lot of devastation there. There was a number of, well, now we can say precursors, but at that time you didn't know that really these were precursors. You can see here a graphic which I took from a very interesting Nature article, which I will, I actually forgot to put it into the reference list here, but I will send it around if you're interested. It's gives a lot of details, and it's very interesting to see it, and it kind of highlights all the different aspects of that case. So there was a swarm of earthquakes preceding that one. Actually, a number was beyond 100 smaller earthquakes that were felt in the region. And so the people were already alerted that something could happen. Additionally, but maybe I should stick to the facts here, to the scientific facts. So you can see a lot of earthquakes, and then the big one here, and the aftershocks of the big one here as well. So these were the number of earthquakes, actually in the hundreds, that were measured. So 0 to 2 is probably not something that you can feel very well, but beyond 2 you can feel the shaking, and between 3 and 4 actually glasses are really heavily shaking, and you see that something's going wrong. Even buildings can be damaged by this magnitude, depending also on the ground, etc. So the public was alerted, and people were afraid of a big one hitting again. The recurrence rate was quite right, so it could have happened in terms of the historic events and things like that. So people were actually afraid that something could happen. This guy actually was an interesting fellow, or is an interesting fellow, Giampaolo Giuliani. He claims to be able to predict earthquakes. And his method is measurements of radon gas emissions from the ground. And so he set up self-employed and self-educated, and he set up a number of radon measurement stations, and from that he derived and actually predicted on a private web page that an earthquake would occur. And he predicted that twice before the large one hit, falsely, obviously, but then still claims till today that he was able to predict the Big Bang. Now, he doesn't have any scientific papers, but he still believes that he is one, that he found the method to predict earthquakes, which the mainstream scientific community still doubts. And so, of course, this guy was in the media and was stirring up the whole popular discussion, and people were even being more afraid. And in that situation, the mayor of L'Aquila called the National Risk Commission, composed of these 6 people: Enzo Boschi, Franco Barberi, Mauro Dolce, Claudio Eva, and, well, probably won't really know the, well, you know these, we know these people now from the news. Before that they were prominent, but they were not overly prominent. They were probably prominent to the educated scientific community, and to sometimes even in the media when it came to larger risks. But there were quite high-ranking people, like the president of INGV, that's the National Italian Earthquake and Volcanic Agency, research agency. There was the vice director of the Department of Civil Protection, Bernardo de Bernardinis, and he played actually a crucial role in this whole thing. So there were quite high-ranking people, and they came together. They were asked by the mayor of L'Aquila to come together for an extraordinary meeting of their commission in order to assess the risk for L'Aquila. Now, in that situation, the commission actually met really extraordinarily. There were no minutes at that time. Now there are some minutes of that meeting, but they didn't really follow the usual rules they had during the time. They just met there and they kind of discussed the issue, and after 1 hour they went out and gave interviews, or even before that they met, they gave interviews on the case, and it was quite obvious that the main intention of inviting them to L'Aquila was to calm down the public, instead of asking them for true scientific advice. So this Mr. De Bernardinis, he gave an interview explaining in long words how the risk hadn't actually increased during for the precursors, and that this doesn't really mean that anything really needs to happen. Actually, I forgot to mention that when you have these swarms of earthquakes, in 2% of the cases, it can mean that you have an increased probability of a Big Bang happening. In 98% of the cases, nothing happens afterwards. And so, yeah, what to tell the people, right? So he explained that in lengthy words, saying, scientifically, we have no increased risk here, but he said it in sloppy words as well. And his interview ended with mentioning that, well, you probably can go home and have a nice bottle of wine now, because even though, he actually added some more evidence that was non-scientific. He said that the number of earthquakes that occur, actually each earthquake that happens decreases the stress in the soil, and therefore decreases the potential for a large earthquake, which is scientifically not sound. He's not a seismologist, though, and he claimed that he got that knowledge from the seismologists. He said there's no increased risk, with some sloppy words in the end, but the message to the public that was kind of received by the public was, there's no risk. Actually, I can have a glass of Montepulciano now. And the problem was that people, by that, were led to deviate from their usual procedures, which were feeling the shaking, going outside, staying the night outside, waiting until it calms down, and then go back home next day. So they felt some shaking, but they decided, well, this guy told us that the risk of a Big Bang is decreasing, so let's stay at home. It was getting cold anyways, and so they stayed at home, which was a big mistake. Okay, so that kind of caused a lot of casualties. It was interesting. I also read in one of the articles that I read for preparation that the percentage of young people was exceptionally high that were killed by the earthquake. One reason, obviously, was that L'Aquila is a university city, but the other reason being that many of the younger generation people have access to the media much more than the older generation. So the old people stick to their routines and went out and stayed overnight outside, while the young people who had access to the media had listened to these well-amplified messages that nothing would going to be happening, and stayed inside and were killed. Okay, so this is basically the facts. A little bit shortened, but I wanted to just bring you on a certain level before we can start the discussion. So let's derive some principles from that. I did that, and maybe you discovered others. So principle number one that I encountered is that the public was actually both insufficiently and biased informed. So it had insufficient and biased information. They did not know exactly what a swarm of earthquakes means. They did not know how to judge that scientifically. There was this guy who claimed that he could predict earthquakes, who failed twice, but of course that is not really anticipated by the public. And he would also not base his findings on a scientific basis, so he would just throw that under the carpet. and things like that. So misinformation is a big ingredient in that, and so the second ingredient is probably that they were mixing science and political decision making. So this commission actually was asked to give scientific advice, but they helped in order to convince the public to stay calm. So that was a mixing of mandates, I think. And to some extent, in the later trial, it turned out that these people were the elite, right? Talking to the ordinary people and giving them wrong advice. Yeah?
Yeah. Could I ask a quick question about the composition of this committee? When scientific seismological information was presented, did that come solely from people who were already members of the committee, of the commission? Or did they come in, were they called in from outside to give scientific evidence?
No, the commission is composed of scientists.
Entirely? And
not entirely. So I think the commission consists of 7 people.
Mm.
These were the ones that were on trial. 6 of them are actually in a scientific environment, so either a federal agency or university. So, but in different fields. So there was a seismologist involved. There was, or 2 or 3 seismologists actually. There were also disaster management scientists involved, and there was one of the disaster management department.
Because underlying that question is another one. Were the people giving seismological evidence in this committee, were they themselves fully knowledgeable?
Well, that seems to be the case. As the president of INGV, I would expect that this person would have, even if he's not the person who did all the research himself, but his institution would be the institution actually recognized worldwide to be on top of things when it comes to seismic events. Yeah. So I think this is not debatable in this case, or at least I wouldn't doubt about that. I mean, you can always have doubts about people, but I think this is not fair in this case. Here's my third principle. It was also a little bit of mainstream science versus a self-educated, self-important autodidact. And to some extent, the scientific community that gathered there were also a little bit of arrogant in terms of we know it better and we don't have to justify ourselves. So that added a grain of salt to that whole kind of mixture of things that went wrong. And I think we have to be very careful about that. Then there was a fourth principle. The wrong question was asked and was answered as well. Or they tried to answer the wrong question. So the question that was on the floor, laid there by the media and by the public, was, will there be an earthquake or not? This question was not answerable. But the question and the mandate of that commission was to answer the question, how high is the risk? And that's a completely different question, and it needs a different answer. But in the public discussion, I think the people in the commission were actually caught by the wrong question, and they didn't really step back and say, hold on a minute, this is not the question that we can answer. They kind of fell into the trap of that question. And the fifth principle that I found is that there was a shared or distributed responsibility that means no responsibility. So everybody claimed that he was not responsible for the real thing. So the disaster managers said, we can't answer the question whether there will be an earthquake. The seismic people would say, well, we just said there is just no increased risk, and things like that. So all people were kind of pushing the responsibility away from them. Would they have known that they would go on trial 2 years or 3 years later, they probably would have acted differently, and they would probably have made more responsible communication to the public, I think.
I'm a little confused there because you keep talking about them communicating to the public. You've only given an example of one person who sounds like the person who was supposed to be communicating to the public, communicating to the public. So is it not the case that the scientists communicated with the chair and the chair communicated to the public, and therefore the communication for the public solely rests on...
Well, actually, I think it's even worse. In this case, the communication to the public is the responsibility for the mayor, for example, for the decision-making local authorities. They get away from that by inviting this commission and let the commission speak.
Fine, but only is, from what you presented, only one member of the commission actually...
That's not true, actually, but this was the most pronounced interview, I think. Other members of the commission also gave interviews and probably said it in different words, not as pronounced and not as... maybe you can...
Yeah, the other member of the commission, the scientific part, for example, didn't correct the wrong message that the vice head of civil protection made, reassuring the citizens. So in this sense, they also agreed it.
Whoa, but hang on there, you're in a really tough position if you decide to do that, right? If you are in a position of providing critical public safety information and you then put out a contradictory story, you're just as likely to be lynched. I mean, I think that to say with 2020 hindsight, well, the most important thing was that the scientists corrected that impression. You can equally argue that the most important thing was that the scientists did not step outside the one line, because if you really had a committee saying 7 different things, then you really wouldn't communicate any information to the public.
Well, you would communicate that the commission was confused.
It's not even clear that you communicate that.
There was no official commission statement.
Right, there was no official statement of the commission in the end. There was no report, as they usually do. So they have like yearly meetings where they assess the risk situation in the country, and there they have official statements in the end, and they have an official report that is handed over to some political whatever decision maker. In this case, they didn't have that. It's true, yeah.
What was the time frame between when this commission met and when the earthquake actually
They
happened?
met on March 31st, I think,
Week.
and the earthquake hit on April 6th.
So it wasn't, they could have, yeah, I mean, they didn't know they didn't have a lot of time, but there wasn't a lot of time.
Right, they didn't know. Of course they didn't know. I mean,
Yeah.
they, at that time, they probably were a little bit sloppy, but acted in good judgment. So, yeah. Right, so these are the 5 principles, and here is our questions and consequences session, and I just put up 3 questions that came to my mind, but we started discussion already, so maybe we can continue with that. I just want to let you know what I thought of. So first of all, we're all predictive scientists in some sense, so we use modeling in order to give some predictions or scenarios or projections. And the question that comes to my mind is, where is our responsibility in that? And can we, that was the first question that came to my mind when I heard of this case. What is my responsibility as a scientist? And I thought about that hard when I did this tsunami business. What can I stand for? If I show somebody an inundation map and they make decisions, and actually that alters immediately things. Some housing prices drop dramatically, insurance rates raise, things like that happen without anything done once you show these results. And can I actually be responsible for that? Can I take the responsibility for that? That's a big question for me, and I would like to discuss that with you and get some kind of, I don't know, maybe I feel more solid ground on that when I hear other people's opinion on that. Then, where do we commit our crimes? I mean, I think I carved out a little bit that there were several points where these people deviated from the standard path and deviated from best practices. And the question is, where do we do that? And is that crucial or not? Can we do that? Can we be responsible for that? So where do we commit our crimes? And thirdly, I think a big issue is the communication. So of course, the public cannot live with somebody saying subtly, there is no increased risk in terms of, and versus there is no risk, right? So we need to be more precise in that to the public. But do we actually speak to the public? Most of us probably don't. Some of us do. Should we speak to the public? For example, when it comes to climate modeling, should we actually be more explicit in saying that there is uncertainty involved?
Yes.
Should we actually say that we don't exactly know about the future? Would that undermine our expertise, or is that actually what we should educate the public to, saying, no, we are not gods, we don't know everything? How do we do that? These are the questions that I would like to raise, and let it run wild now. Thank you.
I think it makes sense to communicate the uncertainty in very clear terms. Because we should distinguish between what is exactly predictable and what is not predictable. Once we communicate to the public what is not predictable, they become prepared. That is like true with the, like I've seen with the monsoon predictions. It is rather the failure of that prediction, the prediction failure creates, I mean, the monsoon failure, it is not so catastrophic, but that fear of failure creates a lot of problem with the public. And that's why it's like, it's important to communicate to them what is possible. So they're intelligent, like they make their own decisions.
Yeah, but that requires an educated public, isn't it?
Yes, like I mean, it has to be communicated in a proper way.
No, the public have to know things they don't currently know.
Sorry?
The public would have to know things that they don't currently know. So we know just from the way the public discourse occurs, not even ordinary members of the public. If you look at, for example, the political discourse, which is typically conducted, despite what the popular press would say, by highly educated, really quite clever people. And we all know that they still foul up concepts to do with numeracy all the time. And that's the best educated, most intelligent members of society. I think it is exceptionally difficult to say, oh, we just communicate the risk theory and people will get that right.
When there's no chance for us to communicate with the public directly anyway, we're going to be doing that filtered through the media. And I mean, so the question is, in this interview, how many actually saw the full interview with all the details in it, or just saw, you know, snippets of a few seconds cut together by some stations communicating something slightly different.
This is perhaps moving away from your questions, but your questions relate to this. We've seen a lot of reports in the press about what led up to the trial. What I have failed to find in the press is any detailed report of how evidence was presented to the trial. I have not seen it myself. Maybe you have, or other people have. So it would be very interesting to know what went on during the trial, which resulted in the conviction. You know, were these questions, predictive sciences, committing crime, communicating, etc., would all have been relevant to the trial? In what terms were they discussed is the question, but you don't know.
I mean, one thing that's clear here is that since there wasn't a lot of documentation, the narrative could be constructed
outside the scientific process. And that narrative basically just builds on itself.
Go ahead. Yeah. I mean, I guess I didn't quite get from just from what you've read about it, do you feel like this commission did their job? And that if the fact that they were now put on trial is really more of a, in some sense, a miscarriage of justice, or do you feel like that they really didn't do their job? I mean, or that, you know, were they up to the standards that, say, you would accept, or that the community would accept?
Well, what are the standards that the community would accept?
Well, I mean, I don't know, but...
Well, I mean, one answer is, so I actually do have legal qualifications, and I am essentially certain that there is no way that under English or Australian law they could be convicted.
Right.
So is it actually appropriate to attempt to police this sort of thing using the criminal law?
Right, so that's one question, right.
Well, there's a potential objection, I think, to what you just said. If strong evidence were to emerge that the Commission held a meeting in which they definitely decided that there was a risk, non-negligible risk, and at the same time they decided to cover it up, and if such evidence could be brought to the court, then I think certainly under British law there would be
That wouldn't make
that would be
that wouldn't make a case for manslaughter. There's absolutely no way you could raise a case for manslaughter on those grounds. There is an offence of misfeasance in public office, which you might just about carry off, although most of those scientists were not, from the sounds of it, public officials, so it's tough to get that one to call off.
But if you conceal a tangible risk for some other purpose, knowingly, and you therefore expose the public to that risk, and members of the public die, that's beginning to sound like manslaughter to me.
Who would be
Well, it
responsible?
doesn't sound like, so it's not generally the case.
In
that
the sense of gross negligence manslaughter.
But I agree, but in order to have gross negligence manslaughter, you need duty of care, and the normal English law is that duty of care does not apply to public policy decisions.
Oh,
so
I
there's
see.
no duty. So therefore, there can't. It doesn't. If there's no duty, then you can't breach it.
Okay,
Yes.
so that's the point, right?
Your opening description reminded me, for all the world, of the famous Spielberg film Jaws, where the mayor of the town calls in people to say that there's no risk. Now, if that's the case, if the mayor of the town called in the commission in order to to settle the nerves of the community, then I think the commission must be at fault for going along with that process. And that, to my mind, is where the professionalism of the commission completely failed, in fact, that they didn't embrace their responsibilities and say, we have a process here and we're going to tell you how it is, and not reassure the community.
Yeah, I
That's
agree
not
to that.
happening.
I don't think that there was actually a clear mandate to
Yes.
calm down the public, of course, but it was, to what I read, there was this this feeling that things were going mad,
Yeah.
because of all these small tremors and because of the public discussion going on.
Yeah.
And so there was probably this under the radar connotation that the commission should make a point and should, in a way, settle things to some extent. Obviously they couldn't, but they felt, probably, that's what I got, and that's what I think they were convicted for. They probably took that. They should probably have said, we don't know, instead of we think there's no problem.
And in British law, there is a problem when experts exceed their expertise in the statements that they make. There's a famous case of a former president of the Royal College of Physicians being struck off when he made statements about the cot death syndrome. When there are two cot deaths in the same family, he said that this was an almost impossible event to occur naturally, and that the mother should therefore be, in almost all cases, convicted of murder if she has 2 children who die from cut deaths. He knew nothing about probabilities. He didn't know what independent events meant, and so on. And he was struck off for exceeding his competence in statements where he laid claim to a certain competence. And that's also part of the problem with this.
But I think that makes my point about English law, because it's exactly the case that he wasn't prosecuted and could not be prosecuted in those circumstances. What happened was that his professional body,
Yes.
which is not the legal process,
Yes,
struck
yes.
him off.
Yeah.
Right, and so I think this raises a really important question. Surely it is more appropriate to have that sort of professional policing of whether or not people have done their jobs than to attempt to fall back on the criminal law, which I don't think would happen. And in his case, even where his direct, I don't know whether you want to call it negligence, but him directly giving evidence that he was not qualified to give, directly led to people being imprisoned, and you can argue indirectly led to deaths, because at least one of the people involved committed suicide after having been released from prison. Even under those circumstances, that isn't a circumstance where prosecution was brought, because it's very difficult to work out how you make criminal law work as a sanction for that sort of...
Yes, but those events are 10 years ago. I think there's an increasing public impatience with elites not being clear and being a little bit smug about their message. I think the responsibility, as Nature article said, the responsibility lies with the communicator to communicate a clear message, not for the listener to find out what that message is supposed to mean. You can't do that. That's not even fair.
Well, for me, one of the solutions was that I think we need to communicate also the ways how we come to certain conclusions. Because if we say how the procedures are that we come to a certain risk assessment or a certain hazard assessment, that in a way, and we need to do that obviously in a way that the public understands that, then if we stick to that path, we are safe, even if we fail. Because then we can always say, well, we did it to the best of our knowledge. The knowledge is not better than that. Sorry. We have to live with that uncertainty. But according to what we said before that we would do in order to assess the risk or in order to assess the hazard, that is what we did, and we didn't deviate from that. If we deviate from that, and if we do some kind of horrible things that do not are not according to the rules that we defined ourselves and that are up to the scientific standards, then yes, I take responsibility for that, and then you can actually set me to trial. But otherwise, if I stick to the procedures that are scientifically sound, then I cannot do any better than this. And then you can't actually...
Well, someone's going to reduce this to one sentence, right? What the public are going to largely hear is a single-digit second soundbite on a news broadcast or a headline. So the question is, who should make that reduction? So if the scientists are going to say, well, we will only do things that we can know are watertight, we're not going to do that in one sentence. So we can hand out the long version, in which case we rely on an unqualified journalist to cut it down to the one sentence version. Is that really a responsible thing to do?
I think
I don't agree with that, actually. I don't agree with that. In the case of natural disaster, of course, that reduces to this short message, and it needs to be reduced to that. But there is always a setting in which you do that, and that setting needs to be prepared. It's a long-term process. You need to educate the public. When you think of weather prediction, that is like 50 years old, numerical weather prediction and all the numerical, the services that do that and kind of spill out the message every evening to main news times, how will be the weather tomorrow. And people got used to, in a way, assess the uncertainty in that. But they have a clear message. They say probability of showers tomorrow. So what does that mean to you? You could take an umbrella or not, right? But we are educated to deal with this uncertainty nowadays, and we kind of take a lot of experience of what they said in the last few times, and upon that we judge our decision, and in some cases it's wrong. In rare events, this is more difficult. I agree. So it's not that easy if it takes 100 years to occur or something like that. Yet, the type of preparation has some analogy to that. You have to be aware of what the scientific basis is on which this message is given, and what kind of judgment you have to do yourself. And then the message needs to be clear. Sorry. Yeah, Donna.
Well, I guess I'm sort of thinking about engineering. I mean, if you build a bridge and the bridge collapses, then they look very carefully at, did you build that bridge to the standards of, what do they call it, best practices or something like that? And if you didn't, if you clearly took shortcuts, if you're a licensed engineer, your license is on the line, you could be sued, the company could be sued, all kinds of bad things can happen. If you did it to the best practices of the community, and those are standardized, then they say, well, yeah, okay, this was, you didn't, like you say, you did the best job you could, or that is known by the society, and maybe it's now time to rethink how we build bridges or something. I mean, couldn't the same idea be used?
But I think that's a good example of, we learn by making mistakes. And so we need lots of data. We learn because this bridge fell down, we learned how to make the bridge better. But extreme events or climate change are something that we don't have a lot of data around. Your slide that said this was the biggest natural disaster in 100 years indicates they don't have a lot of practice. And the next time they will get it right, but we are not well suited for getting things right the first time.
It may well have been, as has been repeatedly stated, it was the biggest in 100 years, but it was by no means the only one in 100 years. Others had also been major and destructive. Again, I'm sort of trying to probe towards things that we probably don't really know here. But given the seismic nature of L'Aquila, one would expect that there would be close monitoring of seismic activity of that area, generally. And that seismologists in whatever the Italian equivalent is of the British Geological Survey here would be analysing current traces and comparing them with analyses of previous traces and evaluating the probability of an outcome from the current swarm. And one wonders whether that was taking place at all.
Yes, actually one of the members of the commission was one of the experts in exactly doing that. And he had published in that field, and he had found exactly those numbers, that in 2% of the cases this is a precursor.
So that 2%,
and in other cases it is not.
Yeah. So does that lead to, given if you compare seismic traces, does that then lead to a specific prediction probability for L'Aquila on that occasion? And was that the 2%?
I mean,
or would it have been higher?
Maybe
no, just because I read a few days ago that there is a study of Boschi that was at the time the past president of INGV, that is the organization that deals with this kind. And in that study is clearly stated that as usually is done in this kind of study, that there was a high probability to have an earthquake in the center of Italy, in that area, let's say, in the next 10 years. But this is a study of 10 years past. So in a sense, that study was right, but in the official documents and even in informal discussion after the commission, nobody mentioned this study, for example. Why? I mean, the answer is in the presentation that you gave, because the commission in our case was called just to discredit a charlatan. And probably scientists blended gave their advisement just to follow some political advisement. This is my opinion. So, okay, we are discussing about very important things, but in this specific case, all is quite a bit complex, complicated by this connection that you show us very well from my point of view.
All the evidence is that the members of the Commission themselves were perfectly capable of understanding the scientific basis of anything of this kind.
Probably no.
Because
example,
you then have the question that you can have, as it were, scientists from outside of the Commission who are true experts, giving their opinion to the Commission, getting the impression that the Commission understand what they're saying, when in fact the Commission do not understand, but are skilled at giving the impression that they do.
But this is exactly what the problem, the issue that the scientist has when try to explain their results to a common people or to the public. It's the same problem, but I think that they should make effort to explain as much as possible, because I think that the final decision should be not to the scientist, but risk manager that probably take into account the scientific part, but also logistics, evidence. I mean, if something is going to happen to London, is different that is going to happen to Cambridge, for example, and or if it rains 100 millimeters per hour, is different if you live on the tree or in a building. So, yeah.
To my knowledge, there is no group in the world right now that makes near-term earthquake predictions. Is there any body that's responsible anywhere for doing that anywhere?
No, so far in the scientific community, it's regarded to be impossible.
Right. So,
Even to come up with a probability.
What would they,
No,
what should they
there-
have asked people?
there's a historical reoccurrence period for
Yes.
earthquakes based on history. But that's not a prediction.
But that is what should have been communicated, I think, is that what should have been communicated is there's a risk of an earthquake here because there have been earthquakes here before. And then possibly what could have been additionally communicated is that sometimes swarms are a precursor. And so yeah, I think one thing that we miss when we communicate is that we need to throw away all the stuff that interests us and communicate the very basic, simplest information. I give a couple talks each year on climate change, and I don't talk about models at all. Because you can convey what you need to do to the public on climate change is simply by telling them that the scientific community has been studying this for 150 years. And when they realize that Tyndall discovered this, that completely changes their frame of reference. So I think what we communicate needs to be very different when we talk to the public.
I think a huge problem, as many people have said already, is communicating the idea of risk and probabilities to the public. I mean, you say people are used to weather forecasts, but still, if the weather forecast says there's a 20% chance of shower and then they get rained on, they get mad at the weatherman for not predicting it properly, even if that was exactly the right probability. People just don't understand, I think, largely the idea of a probabilistic analysis. There was a workshop in Seattle just this summer on tsunami hazard warning, and a lot of the discussion was about probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment and whether the community should be moving more in that direction. And there were a number of emergency managers there from different communities on the West Coast. And not all, but some of them very clearly said, we do not want any probabilistic result. We don't know how to deal with that. We want an inundation map that shows the worst case. That's what we want. So what's the worst case? I mean, the worst case is an asteroid hits the Pacific and half of California is submerged, but that's not what they want either. So you have to kind of figure out what is it that they want and that they can work with and understand but it also conveys the idea of the probabilities of these events. That's a very hard problem, I think.
And this was a second order probability, right? What they were supposed to be able to communicate to the public was with what certainty they could say whether or not what had been observed changed the risk.
Right.
That's really hard.
Involves derivatives as well as
Yeah,
probability. That
absolutely.
makes it even harder.
Bill, you had another.
Well, so, in terms of communications, just look, last week, Sandy, the 100 or so people who died were almost all in evacuation zones. They didn't evacuate, they certainly knew the warnings. They had a hurricane last year that came in a very similar track, flooded, though not severely. There have been historically hurricanes there. But then you read in the news so many people who were shocked at seeing the amount of water that flooded their streets. I couldn't believe it could happen. I've never seen it before. So it just tells you that we don't know how to communicate the risks and consequences of these severe events happening just because they're so rare, as a number of you mentioned.
Or we did do a good job, because only 100 people died.
What?
Maybe,
Well, not for those people, but a lot of people did evacuate.
you know, I think a lot of people did evacuate, so,
But a lot more than those 100 people didn't. There were 100 people who maybe
Yeah.
who got killed, but there are thousands, many thousands in those evacuation zones that were very fortunate to come through.
you mean all the guys with the cameras on CNN? Who were
Yes.
standing there on the beach, on the pier?
For example, also in that case, in my opinion, there has been an issue in communication, because I read that in New Jersey, they make communication about a wrong disaster could happen. In New York, the measure said, stay at home and watch TV.
They have higher buildings in New York.
Yeah.
But I think we're creatures of experience. We could communicate it perfectly, and a lot of people will say, I've never seen water like this before, and so there's no context for them. It's just, we learn through experience, and if it's never flooded here before, and people say it's gonna flood, your house is gonna be underwater, there's a certain number of people that are gonna say, I've lived here all my life, it's never flooded.
And last year, Irene, the forecast for New York, the track potential of what could happen, it was forecast to be much worse in the city than it was. And I think this maybe contributed to more people staying in the city than should have. Because last year, it won't be that bad. I went through last year and it wasn't as bad as they said.
But maybe this is also somehow our fault, because with all the sophistication in our modeling and in our forecasting systems, we might tend to believe our own forecasts more than they are valid. I mean, in terms of, I fell into that trap myself in the tsunami business, because I thought, well, yeah, this is really this is a step forward, what we did, and now we are more precise, and we can rely on that to some extent, and we can take the calculation, the assessment that we do scientifically as a solid ground, and we can avoid the false warnings to some extent, which are also bad, and which we have to deal with. It's not that we can always, so an easy solution would be always be on the safe side, always warn to the worst case, and then say, okay, I warned you, if you didn't go away, it's your own fault. But I think that's not the way to go. So we have to be very careful also to always think of the error bars that we have and really assess that more carefully.
I mean, that example that was just given, I mean, that's an interesting case. I mean, if you always warn to the worst extent, basically, then that will just lead to people not believing you the whole time, basically. So that's not, you're going to be just as negligible, basically, as you were if you underestimated the risk every time.
If the penalty is criminal, if the penalty is criminal, then you will always opt on the safe side.
Right.
You will not get jailed for predicting a hurricane which doesn't happen.
But would you be...
People still get killed if
Would you
their
be right?
evacuations.
Would you be jailed for
So
those?
conceivably,
But you still won't get jailed, right? So
Well-
there isn't. So if you have a system where you attach criminal penalties to fouling up the science or failing to communicate the science effectively, which appears to be what's happened in this case, then you really do push in one direction only, right?
But it's not completely true, because in Hawaii, for example, last year there was a tsunami warning, and people were evacuating for hundreds of, I don't know, it cost several million to evacuate the coastal regions there, and nothing happened. Mm-hmm. And I know that there were some cases where people tried to sue NOAA for giving a false warning.
But did they succeed? Right? People will always try and sue. This is a really common false argument. Right? We can't do that, someone will sue us. Someone can always sue you. The relevant question is, will they win?
Well, no one had won in the case like L'Aquila until now.
Sorry?
No one had won in a case like L'Aquila until now. But
well, no one, hang on. No one won L'Aquila, it was a criminal case. No one won in L'Aquila, it was a criminal case. So this is the...
One in the sense of convicting.
Well, there isn't another side, right? It's an inquisitorial justice system. This is why I've actually come down to the position where the scientific community should be very, very firm in this. What the Italian state has done in L'Aquila is just wrong and should not occur. And it should not occur because it is wrong to criminalize scientific advice. You can have discussions about professional standards, you can have discussions about striking people off, but it is harmful to the process for exactly these reasons, for exactly the fact that it pushes externally in one direction only, to criminalize that we should say, no, that should not occur.
I ask a question here.
Sorry.
When do you call an act criminal? Only when the motive is established. There's a mal-intention.
No, that's actually not true, and that wasn't true in this case, right? You don't always have to show intent in the sense that you're talking about in order to establish a crime. And as I understand this case, intent wasn't shown and didn't need to be shown. This is the nearest English law equivalent was gross negligence manslaughter. It's not actually the same offence, right? We shouldn't fall into the trap of assuming that they have been convicted for the same offence that exists in our legal system. But my understanding of the situation is this is not what we would call a full mens rea offence.
Are there convictions being appealed? Do they have a chance?
Oh, they will be. The Italian system...
Are they expected to be overturned?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nobody knows.
You did say nobody should be convicted or accused or prosecuted for giving scientific advice. And in those particular terms, I totally agree. But I think the question lurking in this case is, was the advice which emerged scientific?
That's the same story, right? And I think that causes the same problem, right? So the consequences for being on a commission like this and stating and saying something which you shouldn't have said should be professional and not criminal. That is what I'm saying.
I think that you should distinguish between the prediction of an event, whatever can be, by the prediction of the risk of that event can produce. We can, with a very extreme high accuracy, we can predict the risk of an event. If an earthquake will happen in that city, probably we can know which building will collapse because we can measure the building, but we cannot measure underground, for example. So if you distinguish between the prediction of the event and the prediction of the risk, probably it could be understood why, if someone failed to predict a risk, should be accused of something like that. So scientists probably are going to predict events with models, and nobody, I think, can say
I don't think that's a
on
relevant distinction in this circumstance.
I know of one example in the U.S. of people suing because of a bad forecast. And this was back in the 90s. A big site off the East Coast, ship sank, people died. And it was bad forecast, it was not well forecast at all. And there was a buoy out there that NOAA maintained that was out of order. And the basis of the suit was that NOAA was negligent in repairing that buoy, and had that buoy been there and giving data, putting data into the forecast system, the forecast would have been better, and the ship's captain would have known about it, and it wouldn't have sank.
They win.
Well, it turns out they had expert witnesses. I knew some of them, and you can imagine how arcane this got when they're trying to describe data assimilation and what it means to have that one observation in court. Just imagine. For those who had you, I thought, wow. You know, it turns out they didn't, because I think the more credible expert witnesses were on the defending the forecast side, and the ones that were on the being hired by the people who brought the suit were more or less on this sort of kind of pseudo-science side that didn't really understand a lot. But this actually got all the way through court. The trial went all the way through, and they didn't find for the people bringing suit. But that brought up a lot of discussion, I remember at the time, as to, well, wait, can we actually get sued for our forecasts?
I mean, there are certainly cases, again, engineers, doctors get sued all the time for professional miscalculations. I mean, again, getting sued versus winning the suits, but people are able to, you know, and it's clear that there's clear cases of negligence when they lose, and then there's clear cases of, sorry, we just simply don't know how to cure cancer yet.
But that's a really, really different thing.
Well,
from being
it is
prosecuted.
different, only in the sense that, I mean, it seems to me that in the sense that is extremely well-established practice in which, you know, thousands of doctors are practicing doing the same thing every day, and so there's lots of data
And
on
even
what
in that
constitutes
case-
professional standards.
But even in that case, where the professional standards are so much better defined, we still do not criminalize the profession. Right? And that professional is in a much better regulated position
I'm not so
than,
sure about
no, you're talking about doctors being sued for negligence, which happens. You're talking about doctors being struck off for negligence, which happens. That's really, both of those two things are really, really different from being prosecuted. That's a huge distinction. That's the huge distinction that I think applies here.
Then being what?
Prosecuted. What happens with a crime?
Criminal versus civil.
Well, I think here we do now have this interesting issue
Being sued
between
is pretty bad, right?
criminal law,
Go to jail.
where you are
You
prosecuted
lose your license.
on accusation of a crime, and civil law, where you are being sued on the accusation that you've caused damage.
There is a licensing procedure.
Now, maybe somebody knows this. I don't know what it's like in Italy, but of course we all know in this country, proof of a criminal offence requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, which is quite a strong criterion. Whereas you can lose a civil case simply on balance of probabilities, as they put it. And I have heard it stated in court that 51 to 49 can be enough.
Building collapses.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what the law is.
And so how is it in Italy?
I'm not an expert on Italian law. So the law, so the one thing I do know is that the criminal burden of proof has to be not hugely distinct from beyond reasonable doubt, because beyond reasonable doubt is enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights.
Ah.
So everywhere in Europe has to have something, you know, beyond reasonable doubt is the common law term, and English lawyers basically wrote that convention, which is why that term's used. But I believe that the ECHR case law has said that the terminology which is used in various civil law jurisdictions, which is different, amounts to roughly the same thing, and the ECHR has generally been satisfied that the criminal standard of proof around Europe is roughly the same.
May I intervene at this point? Because I don't think that it leads us as scientists so much further when we know how the different law systems work.
Well, the
What
question
kind
is
of
important. in fact.
accusation they are facing. For me, it was more important to kind of carve out what is the consequence for us. How should we deal with the situation, whether we will be accused or not? That I hope that none of us will be ever in this situation, and the cases are still rare. So
Well, I
we
think
can
one-
hope that we actually get away. But so the risk is quite low in this case.
Well, one thing which is important in addressing that particular thing, and I think it has actually come up a few times, is what was the nature of the situation in which these scientists found themselves, and had they let themselves be drawn into it? If you, for instance, if I do some scientific consultancy and I do my best, then that's it, and I would not expect to be held liable if someone should think it was the wrong thing, so long as I can justify what I did. But if I were to be drawn into some committee which was torn different ways by multiple purposes, and I was not able then to get my objective scientific evidence properly on the table, then, you know, perhaps I should not have allowed myself to get drawn into that situation.
Yes, I think from the perspective we are in here, we cannot really judge that. We cannot really
Exactly.
know that.
We don't really know.
We don't know how the discussion went in that commission. There is some evidence about that. I think it was more public than it used to be. So there were some witnesses in that discussion, but I don't know the details. Do you know more about that?
No, I don't know, but I can add a point about the sentence that has been issued last week, if I remember well. The motivation of the sentence has not been issued. I mean, following the Italian laws, when you are judged, you receive just the judgment, but the judge has 3 months to write the motivation.
The reasoning, I think you mean, yeah.
Actually, now, nobody knows in details, person by person of the commission, why they have been judged in this way.
But it will come out.
Of course, in 3 months. And another thing is there are 3 level of judgment in Italy. So this is the first one. So they probably made appeal to the second and then to the third one. So quite nobody in jail so far. And probably
the next level will depend upon reading the judgment from the first.
Yeah, probably have had some inputs.
Not in the same way you think of in an English case.
I mean, it's not the part. No, it's not a continuation. Start again from.
Oh dear.
Yes.
Yes, this is why I'm talking about 10 and more years to have a final conclusion.
Has there been a coordinated response from the scientific community, professional societies or whatever, writing positions, papers on why this is?
AGU wrote a position, AAAS wrote a position, EGU wrote a position. Most of the geosciences communities responded to that.
And what's
Most
the
of them
position?
actually were, to what I saw, were a little bit superficial.
Well, because
in the sense, like David proposed to say, you cannot go for trial for a scientific advice, and if you impose that, then this will kill scientific advice to the public. There needs to be some freedom in that. Although I'm not completely satisfied with that, personally, I have to say, because I think as scientists we also have the obligation to be responsible. And to some extent, responsibility always means that it can have consequences. So the question is, where is our responsibility and where is the consequence that we can face? And in that regard, I agree with you, David, that the consequence cannot be to criminalize that, unless they really did something criminal. In this case, I can't see that. So it would be probably the again, you should be take responsibility for in terms of having to leave your job or losing your license or whatever. And maybe even be charged of paying some what do you call that, fine and things like that. but certainly not to be criminally.
Well, but
But if that's what the Learned Society has been saying, I think that goes to the heart of what the international community can say about this case, right? Even external experts are not really in a better position to conduct an inquiry into intimate facts than a judge on the ground. So in that respect, I think they're right to step back from that and say the problem with this is not necessarily the contents of the inquiry that you've had and the consequences you've come to. The problem with this is that it's a criminal inquiry at all. And that's the thing that needs to be fixed. And I think that is exactly the right thing for the international community of scientists to say.
Okay. So it seems that we are all ready for a coffee now.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for the interesting discussion.